What does mean, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. Jung. Ideas as something that's alive. Because people are alive, we're trying to use our cognitive ability to further our living. The purpose of those ideas is to embodiment them, to have them acted out. Ideas take on life of their own over time. As they take on a life of their own, their capacity to dominate someone increases. Until the idea is more powerful than the person. E.g. Islam, a set of ideas exploded out of some source and swept through a vast population. Or Christianity in China, is spreading faster than it did in the Roman times. Ideas have their own goal, perception, and a way of interacting with the world, and they can possess people. Why do we feel exposed and vulnerable when we know and do what we really like? People behave behind a shell, even at cost to them. Because if the shell gets criticized, isn't very relevant, because it doesn't have direct bearing to them. So, if you're not showing your true self to the world, just showing something false or constructed, that gets criticized, you can comfort yourself saying that isn't you under attack. That's why people protect themselves with falsehoods and ideologies. Attempt to shield their genuine vulnerability from assault by the world. But if you don't allow that vulnerability to manifest itself, the probability that you're actually going to get what you really like it's zero. By protecting yourself you end up losing what you're trying to protect. I can understand that, because the vulnerability isn't just felt, it's real. People are fragile, subject to terrible forces of nature, culture. We put all sorts of masks in front of ourselves so that exposure's limited. If your false is enough then it's also false to you, to protect against their own self-criticisms. How can high school teachers best promote virtue, cultivate morality, and tackle the meaning crisis? In the face of an increasingly chaotic, violent, and dehumanized future? I don't think the future will be that way. The past was rough. There's no reason to be so pessimistic. To promote virtue and cultivate morality is within your own life. But to do that in yourself and transmit that, you need to understand that morality isn't a set of injunctions. Like, don't ever do anything impulsive that you like. People think of morality as something that a puritanical person might preach, mostly with self-control and self-constraint. That's shallow. To convince people to act morally is to meditate on the utility of the truth. Because if you follow what's false, you end up somewhere that you weren't planning to go, which will be bad. If your eyes are open and pay attention, the probability to maneuver around terrible obstacles that will emerge in your life is no much higher. Make 2 fundamental points. 1. Do you want things to be better? 2. Do you want things to be worse? To make things better, you need to adopt a tremendous amount of responsibility. That's effortful, difficult and frightening. If you have your mind straight and oriented in that direction, truth is your best possible guide, it'll help you get to that point. Morality isn't abstract, it's practical, the most practical over the longest possible span of time. The moral act is what's best, all things considered. It's necessary for people to follow conventional rules. Because convention is part of the wisdom of mankind. And it's say, here's a pathway you can follow, the best for you. Grow up - intimate relationship of stability - do something productive - raise children - establish yourself in a community. That's not such a bad deal. If you pull all those things properly, at least you'll have a life that isn't full of unbearable suffering with nothing positive in it, and probably will be a good life, so you want to try to do that correctly. Act morally / in a virtuous manner. It's in your interest and in everyone else's interest as well. It will mean to put off some forms of impulsive pleasure, because you have pleasure at haste and you repent at leisure. So, morality inform you of how you might act in the present, to be acceptable, but also tomorrow, next week, next year, also, it's good, for you, family, community. So, if you want to make things worse, think it's through, that's not a good plan. Is mindfulness really beneficial or is it just a trend? Mindfulness, it's a giant box to put a lot of things, and claim that's not only what it is but that's what it does. Teaching that doesn't produces any benefit. It's just a fad. How can Disney produce an archetypal masterpiece in the mid-90s, Lion King, and then turn around and create propaganda in the new millennium, Frozen? I agree. But Frozen, it's the highest grossing animated movie that's even been made. So, not only they created propaganda properly, also people are hungry for it. Why? Well, one of the ideological motifs in Frozen. The classic idea that the Sleeping Beauty needs a prince to awaken her is absurd and old-fashioned. And there are alternative ways of traveling through life that don't require the subjugation of that story might appear to entail. That's really naive. The idea of the feminine is waiting for the masculine to awaken her. It's just as true for men and women. It's more of the feminine part of a man, which is the part that enables him to have a relationship with a woman at all, is awoken by the archetypal masculine qualities of clarity of mind, just as much as the females. Femininity is awoken by masculine clarity of mind. But people want the propaganda because it tells them that what they already think is correct. And the old wisdom can be dispensed. That people can conduct their lives in any manner that they want. Well, that doesn't work. You have said that to study history is to study oneself, and that one will be much more grounded and stronger if they do so. Will you please talk more on this? You are at your 30s. And you can think that you're actually 30 years old. But you're not. In at least one level on analysis. You're 3.5 billion years old. So, you're a consequence of this massively extensive evolutionary process that's conditioned every aspect of you. You're very ancient from a biological perspective. If you don't view yourself across that entire span of time, you have the wrong idea of it means to be a human being. In the cultural end of things, you're shaped and inhibited and offered opportunity by the history of human cultural endeavor, which is also unreactive in the causal manner with the emergence of our biology across time. And if you don't understand history, then you don't understand who you are. Because you're a product of history. Every thoughts and words. The probability that you have an original thought is extraordinarily rare. So, your own thought process is far more deeply if you're an astute student of history. Also, you understand the problems that confront you in the world. You're born into the world in a particular historical configuration, archetypal truth, which is a consequence of vast patterns of processes that have laid themselves out on a historical time frame. E.g., the interpersonal complicities that young people experience in their intimate relationships are a direct consequence of the birth control pill. It's only being around for 50 years. So, if you don't understand that the birth control burst in on humanity like an atomic bomb, you don't understand what it is that's driving your own interpersonal problems. There's no difference between studying history and psychology and trying to understand who you are and what you should do. History is about the world and you. If you're not fascinated and horrified by it, then you're not studying history properly. Why do humans enjoy sad stories? Someone watching some would sentimental and cry. And you might say that that's an element of being sad. But it's actually an element of being compassionate, and participation in this fictional love and intimacy that human being is capable of. That will produce sentimental and nostalgic emotions, associated with tears. Also, because they're compelled to understand the tragedies of their lives. See that tragedy on a stage, that it's distilled and amplified. To simultaneously engage in the problem of wrestling with what it means to exist in a tragic world. So, any information you get, will be worth any momentary negative emotion that you'll experience. Life can be sad and we have to figure out how to deal with it. So, stories can tell you how to deal with them good or badly. If Christianity has much historical wisdom to offer, why is it so derided in the academy? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? People think that Christianity is science for stupid people. And reduced to the most fundamentalist manifestations. The strawman of Christianity, and say that Bible is literally true. And the cosmos is 1,000 years old. It's easy to make fun of that. Sometimes its fear, narrow-mindedness, and ignorance is actually the attempt to preserve something of extraordinary value, which has not been fully articulated. So, people create that strawman just to feel intelligent by comparing their own knowledge to that. I think Marxism contributes to it a lot. It's terrible that Marxism is still taught in universities, populated by neo-fascist ideas. What drives the new Marxist analysis of Christianity is its simple-mindedness. Marxists tend to reduce everything to power or to economics. Reduce everything to any one thing is a mark of a weak mind. I think there's a hatred for the responsibility that genuine Christianity lays upon a person, at an archetypal level. Jung. The soul is naturally Christian. There are elements of Christianity that have taken conceptualization as far as it can go, that's what makes them archetypal. E.g., human being make progress by making sacrifices. On the Old Testament people make genuine archaic sacrifices. A prized animal and burn it and offer it to God. Because they thought that the world was a flat disk, and on top of that disk was a bowl. The bowl was the sky. And outside the bowl that's where the gods existed. I think, they believed that, for the same reason that we feel odd when we look up in the night sky. Because they're looking into the infinite, and that's allied very tightly with divinity. So, the smoke rises and God can detect the quality of your sacrifice. It's a representation of a profound idea. The idea that, sometimes in order to make things go properly you have to let go of something that you deeply love or deeply want to do. So, sacrifice is to let something go in the present so that the future can be better. Or to let something go personally so that other people can have it better. There's no difference between sacrifice and the discovery of the future. Once you realize the future you have to sacrifice things in the present, so the future it's more acceptable. If we change our behavior in the present better things could happen in the future. Sacrifice something of value. Sacrifice is based on faith. Reality can be positively shaped by sacrifice. The higher quality the sacrifice, the more profound the positive effect on the future. The most valuable possible sacrifice, it's obviously yourself. So, the ultimate moral injunction is to sacrifice yourself in a manner that makes the future better. The central mythological figure at the core of Christianity is the person who voluntarily sacrifices themselves to the benevolent will of God. If you're a rationalizing intellectual, who the hell wants to believe that? That your moral obligation is to sacrifice yourself for the best. The archetypal stories means that you end up crucified. There's lots of reason to be not very happy about that idea. The other question. Christianity is derided in the academy is a good or bad thing. It's a terrible thing. It's not like Christianity can't use some criticism. Nietzsche took care of that for us. But the academy is running from the responsibility of bearing our culture and revivifying it. Using appalling rationalizations and ideological maneuvers to make acceptable that personally, and proselytize about it to others. My cynical part says that universities now do students more harm than good. Especially in humanities. They take students when their belief systems and the ability to identify strongly with life are already somewhat in question. Because they exist in a culture that's been badly fractured. And expose them to ideas that are absolutely destructive. Like reading Nietzsche or Dostoevsky. But their purpose is not to destroy. It's to remove detritus. So that something new can spring forth. I don't see that happening in universities. They're too cynical. And a strong streak of serious anti-humanity among modern intellectuals. Like the Club of Rome in the 1960s, said that the world would be better off if there were fewer people on it, or maybe that there were no people on it. You can't say anything more appalling than that. The Columbine kid said that, so. Can you explain Nietzsche's general philosophy and some of his most famous ideas? Nietzsche is so damn complicated, I don't think you can do that. He wasn't really a systematize. It's really difficult to distill a non-systematized into a few general principles. So, you have to read the original writings. Because the brilliance is encapsulated in the original writings, they can't be condensed. Truth serves life. Human being is in an existential situation that's characterized by the necessity of determining what he or she will actually accept as truth. Truth isn't just something that you can prove. Because you need to decide what criteria you accept as proof, there's an act of faith. Like, the ought conundrum. You use science to lay a very detailed description of the objective world. Still doesn't mean that you know how to act in that world. It's a fundamental problem. If the fundamental problem of people isn't what is the nature of the objective world, but how is the way you should conduct yourself while you're alive? The Nietzsche fundamental question was how you should conduct yourself while you're alive, fundamental question of meaning. Science can inform you, but can't solve that problem for you. That impels people to the conclusion that there's no answer of how you should act in the world. That opens the door to nihilism, which is destructive, doesn't facilitate life. It takes the motivation out of people. Makes them bitter, resentful, hateful. Also, Nietzsche concerned is how to act. That's why he decomposes Christianity. He believed that Christianity was a very serious attempt to answer how you should act. And believed it had become fatally flawed. In its typical socially instantiated form. So, he took it upon himself to subject it to a criticism. I always thought of Nietzsche as a maggot in a wound. He's clearing away dead and diseased tissue. So that something else can live. It's a terrible thing to watch, apprehend, a terribly destructive thing to involve yourself in. He philosophized with a hammer. Clear the path for something new. That something new he was trying to formulate with his conception. Like the Superman. The next version of human being. As people who would create their own values. That would be the way out of the wreckage of Christianity. I think he was wrong, with all due respect. Because people don't create values, they discover them. You can't create values by conjuring them out of non-existence. You might think values are in some sense arbitrary. But values aren't arbitrary, and people discover them and maybe co-create them. Jung was a student of Nietzsche and Freud. Jung was trying to understand what the way forward might be given the situation that Nietzsche described. Which was, Christianity laid so much emphasis on truth that it ended up undermining its own axiomatic presuppositions. Then Jung thought, following Nietzsche. Well, in principle we have to create new values, that's why Jung was so interested in the unconscious. And he found, in the collective unconscious, that the values that Nietzsche thought people should create were actually lying dormant in our imagination, collective unconscious. That the way forward of the generation of new values was a return to the deepest recesses of human existence, and a rediscovery of what was actually there. E.g. the necessity of sacrifice. It's the archetypal idea that the savior is by definition the person who is willing to sacrifice herself for the ultimate good. And that's the appropriate pathway forward. That's an archetype of Christianity, and I think Jung is correct. That's a terrible thing to say. Because Jung was such a radical thinker. The things that Jung was messing around are so complicated and terrible compared to just building a little cult, like the book The Aryan Christ says. That's why Jung and also Christianity is subject to such continual rationalist and criticism. People open up and take a look at what he's doing. And either just don't get it at all. Or they get a little bit of it. And it scares them so badly. And they think there's no damn way they're going there. Is it a good idea to believe in healthy delusions like karma or life after death? 15 years ago, the most cited social psychological paper ever written was about the necessity of positive illusion. Life was so tragic and dismal that unless you bolstered yourself against it with defensible optimism, you are charitable. Just positive illusions, lies is what I think they are. That life would actually be intolerable. That's an unbelievably nihilistic and vicious philosophy. It's an absolute indictment of the entire field that it was talked about it. There's nothing about illusions that are healthy. That doesn't mean that cynicism, despairs and nihilism are forms of truth. There are no such thing as healthy delusions. I believe in karma. No one gets away with anything, ever. Every single thing that you do that is immoral, an attempt to twist the structure of reality. It comes back to haunt you, in multiplied form. Doesn't mean that you'll draw the causal connections. You did something immoral 5 years ago. That cracked the structure of your being. 5 years later and all sorts of things are falling into that crack. And you don't know that that initial act produced this consequence of events. What did Camus mean by revolt in the myth of Sisyphus? What are some ways to revolt without being destructive? Or should one simply be a good ant? It's not so simple to be a good ant. Being a good ant is better than just being a chaotic and useless ant. So, you should go from chaotic and useless ant to good ant. Mature. You adopt the strictures and responsibilities of your culture to discipline yourself. But if you stop at the point where you're a good ant, then you're an avatar of the pathologies of your culture, and of the virtues of your culture. But fighting against merely culturation, it's not virtue, that's just failure to mature. Nietzsche, are you leading or are you just running away? If you're not doing what other people are doing, you're running away. If you've got a unique destiny, that you have to manifest, more power to you. But most people who think they have a unique destiny, they're just wandering into some ditch where things are not going to be good for them. Revolt without being destructive. You could try revolting against your lack of discipline. That's a war. People need a war. People need a moral equivalent to war. William James. I think that was Jung was trying to discover. The moral equivalent to war. I think he discovered it as well. That's tied up with the idea of sacrifice. If you want to revolt, do it against your own pathology, inadequacy, uselessness, resentment, cruelty, and blindness. You can have a war against that give you something to do. MRA people are often quite smart. Why do they have a strong tendency toward atheism? People who are smart get atheistic right away. It's obvious. You believe in God, an old man in the sky, Christ turned wine into water. Who wasn't foolish would believe that? That's the statement of someone who's smart enough to start to notice something about what people believe. But they're 10 steps along up 50,000-mile journey. Also, people like to think they're atheistic is because they're clear-headed and rational. Probably they're not. How often you meet someone who's clear-headed and rational? I'm always looking for the dark reason that someone is doing something, rather than the light reason. The reason that's moving them towards the light. Because it's hard to move towards the light. And it's a fashionable way to be able to revolt if you're rational and if you're kind of an intellectual. But also, you can just dispense with responsibility if you're atheistic. And I think that's 90% of the reason. Or they hate the church. Like Richard Dawkins. I would swear that something happened to him when he was a kid that wasn't good. He has such an animus against the church, it possesses him. Can you explain why the conventional wisdom about ancient people is so at odds with your ideas about ancient people? People like to think they're smart. The easiest way is to think that other people aren't. They think that people who came before us, they didn't know what we know. Well, they didn't have our technological capacity. That doesn't mean they were stupid. Like, back in Athens, they're not gonna last very long. Lack of respect. Be respectful. If you don't want to be nihilistic, you better be respectful. Being respectful and have respect for nothing are exactly the same thing. You can start by having respect for your ancestors. And try to figure out what they were talking about. Like the Old Testament. It's weird book. Lots of people wrote it, edited it. It got sequenced together and turned into this volume. For reasons that we just can't understand. It's a collective work of human imagination. And people read it in such a simple-minded way. Like simple-minded fundamentalist Protestants think about science. They think the Bible is literally true, and science is literally true, thus the Bible is science. Well, no. Scientists didn't write the Bible. The modern critics of traditional religious thinking. They do the same thing except backwards. They say religion was science, just bad science, so we don't have to pay any attention. Well, it's not science, it's something else. It's ethics, it's morality, it's drama. Drama is about how to live. And religious drama is a definitional issue. There's nothing deeper than religious drama. Because depth defines what's religious. Like, in my clinical practice, I see people who are in terrible trouble, which is ethical. If their trouble is bad enough, there's no other language to conceptualize it in, that isn't religious. Because religious language comes into its own when you're dealing with problem not only of life and death, but literally of heaven and hell. If you think there's no such a thing as hell, disappointment. I can't see how someone who's educated would ever dare to make that claim. After everything that happened to us in the 20th century, I can't see that someone could ever say that there's no such thing as hell. Hell is real, and if you want to talk about it, use religious language. And if you want to figure out how to get away from hell, you use religious language. That's what it's for. If you want to learn about this, read Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Jung, Eric Newman. The information is there, waiting for people to understand it. It's hard slogging. And the problem is that you get to hell way before you get to heaven. One of Jung's fundamental proposition is that if you follow a meaningful and truthful path, that will take you to the worst place you can imagine. And then, possibly having gone there, the journey uphill, towards the light can begin in earnest. Who wants that? No one if they have any sense. But also, he said, anything you don't thoroughly understand you act out in the world as fate. If you don't want hell to manifest itself in the world, you better understand your role in producing it. That's the primary religious injunction. And that's why belief systems, like Christianity, it's the foundation of Western civilization. The fundamental moral injunction on Christianity is, you want to constrain hell within yourself. If you look at the sorts of things that happened in Nazi Germany, USSR, Mao's China, there's systematic torture and persecution of millions of people, where the entire state was devoted towards making things as cruel as they can possibly be, and then making them even worse after that. People played a role in that, and they were people like you. That mean that people like you play a role in that. So, the question is, what's your role, and if it's that the game that you want to be playing, to the degree that you're a person, and you don't want that to happen anymore, you have to sort that out within yourself. Another deeply religious idea, an archetypal idea, about the Messiah, is the person who takes the sins of the world unto himself. It means that you look for the motivations that drove Hitler in yourself, because they're there. It means that you have to view yourself as the perpetrator of archetypal evil. Jung. If you take a small moral failing that a person manifests and you dig into that as deeply as you can, you end up in the center of hell, go down to the archetype. That's why people want to have conversations about this sort of things. You see it happening in intimate relationships, where the person involved will just not talk about it. Why? Because they don't want to go there. They don't want to get to the bottom of things. No wonder. That's an archetypal idea. Hell is a pit, it's at the bottom of things. And you need to go there, if you want to straighten things out. The alternative is that it plays itself out in the world. And we've already seen that. It's not a good idea.